Good morning. Welcome to our last day in the Seattle area. We're going to be heading over to Kristen Pfaff's apartment soon, but right now I'm in the backyard and I've heard these fighter jets. There's actually a military base nearby, and every now and again we'll see them fly over, but you definitely hear them before you see them. But at this point, it's just kind of become background noise. The noise doesn't deter these guys though. They are so cute. A couple of weeks ago, whenever I would come outside, these fawns would run away. And now they're getting more comfortable. Yesterday, I was just sitting out here and they came right up to me and decided to hang out. But anyway, this is our last full day in the area, and I've been thinking about Kurt and all the strange things surrounding his final days. And when I think of his death here in Seattle, it's hard not to think about Kristen Pfaff. You'll want to stay to the end of the video because there's a quote about what happened to Kristen by her one-time bandmate Courtney Love that is just odd. No, it's not even odd, it's highly irregular. Now, there is some mystery surrounding the circumstances of her death, and I touched on Kristen's connection to Kurt in our deep dive series. I've linked it below if you haven't watched it, but I hadn't planned on visiting Kristen's final home while we were here. I just didn't think we would have enough time, but we do have an extra day and I'd like to head over there. And on the way, I'll give you some background about her and tell you about her final days. I'll be curious as to what you guys think, so you'll have to let me know in the comments. Kristen was born in 1967 in Amherst, New York, which is a suburb of Buffalo. She came from a musical family. Her birth father's family had many successful musicians, and her younger half-brother is also a musician. Growing up, she learned how to play piano and the cello. She graduated from the University of Minnesota and majored in women's studies, and she was passionate about women's rights, and while she was in college, she worked for many organizations that helped victims of violence. While living in Minneapolis, she taught herself how to play bass, and in 1991 co-founded the band Janitor Joe. While on tour in 1993, she met Eric Erlandson from Hole at one of her shows. Hole was looking for a bass player for their band, and Eric thought that Kristen would be a perfect fit. Eric, along with Courtney Love, asked her to join, but she declined and went back to Minneapolis. But they were both clearly impressed with her talent because they continued to pursue her. Hole's first album, Pretty on the Inside, did so well and generated so much interest that they ended up signing an 8-album deal with Geffen Records. And Geffen was the label back then. Let me know in the comments if you want me to do a video on the history of the label, as well as all the bands that signed with them. But after talking with her father about the opportunity to join Hole, Kristen ultimately decided to leave Janitor Joe and move out to Seattle and give it a go. She was smart though. Even though Hole seemed to be a great opportunity, she wasn't sure if the band would be a good fit for her, so she only signed on for one album and one tour. In 1993, Hole began rehearsing for their album Live Through This. And with the addition of Kristen on bass, the band was complete. Eric later said that it was when Kristen joined the band that Hole really took off and became a real band. Now, Eric and Kristen began dating, and their relationship lasted for most of 1993. And at that time, heavy drug use was rampant in Seattle. Eric said that Kristen had dabbled in drugs before moving to Seattle, but it was really light. Unfortunately, after her move out here, she did become addicted to heroin. And some reports say it was just within a matter of weeks of moving here. Now, while in the band, there was some friction between Courtney and Kristen. And for some background, prior to dating Kristen, Eric had been dating Courtney, but Courtney left him for Billy Corgan from the Smashing Pumpkins. But some say that he was still very much in love with Courtney. Eventually, Courtney ended up leaving Billy for Kurt. And at the time, many would argue that Kristen was a better musician than Courtney. Courtney wasn't really a musician at all when she started the band. She didn't really understand melody. Both Billy and Kurt actually taught her how to be more melodic in her compositions. And Kristen, well, she was a trained musician, and she was pretty vocal about her ideas on what direction to take their music, so perhaps that rubbed Courtney the wrong way. While Kristen's talent and romantic relationship with Eric may have caused some friction, it was probably made worse by the friendship that organically formed between Kristen and Kurt Cobain. Their relationship was totally platonic, and they had a lot in common. Kurt and Kristen were both quiet, loved art, reading books, and talking about the history of rock and roll. They would spend hours on the phone just chatting about those topics. And Courtney noticed the connection between Kristen and her husband, and understandably was not really happy about it. Now, Kurt didn't bond and connect with people like he did with Kristen. For example, Kurt's favorite book was Perfume by Patrick Suskind, and it was a book that meant a lot to him. And when he gave Kristen a copy, he wrote her a little note inside of it, and that was really the final straw for Courtney. She became openly critical and hostile towards Kristen, and it was just uncomfortable and awkward. And according to Kristen's mother, Janet, in early 1994, Kristen had a near-fatal overdose. And that, combined with all the drama with Hole, Kristen decided to move back to Minneapolis. While she was there, on April 8th, 1994, news broke about Kurt Cobain's death, and Kristen was absolutely devastated. Kurt had been a good friend to her, and she had a lot of respect for him. Her mom later said that it was on that day that Kristen stopped doing drugs. She actually checked herself into rehab the next day. After her time in rehab, she did a quick tour with Janitor Joe in May, and moving back to Minneapolis seemed to be a good thing for her. She was back with her friends, making music, and away from the drug scene in Seattle. Things were really turning around for her, and she decided that she was going to stay in Minneapolis, but she still had some of her things in her apartment in Seattle, where we are coming up to now. Kristen came back here on July 15th, 1994, to pack up the last of her belongings with her friend Paul Erickson. Now, originally her cousin, who was a security guard, was going to come here with her, but he had a conflict in his schedule, so she came out with Paul. And the plan was to get in, pack up the U-Haul truck, which was parked right here, and leave the next morning and drive back to Minneapolis. So it was a really short trip. Her apartment number was 101, and I'm not sure which windows here are to that apartment. I would think it would be towards the front, but I'm not sure, and I'll take you around the whole building. But this is where things get weird and where people start to wonder what really happened. So it's been said that during this short visit to Seattle, Courtney Love did visit Kristen earlier that day before her death, but we don't know if that actually happened. What we do know is that she did have an unexpected visitor that night. So on the 15th, Paul and Kristen packed up the U-Haul. Paul stayed downstairs in the truck and planned to sleep in it overnight to protect Kristen's stuff because there was a lot of crime in the area. While he was down there, he said that Eric Erlandson stopped by around 8:30 that night. Now, even though the relationship was over, Kristen and Eric were on good terms. And Paul said that Eric wasn't there too long, and shortly after he left, he went inside to the apartment to check on Kristen. And when he went inside, he discovered that she was in the bathroom with the door locked. And he could hear her inside snoring, which, as strange as that sounds, her father later said that Kristen falling asleep in the bathtub wasn't that unusual. And Paul knew this, so he left and went back into the truck and went to sleep. Early the next morning, Paul went inside the apartment and quickly knew something was wrong. It was silent inside, and Kristen was nowhere to be found. When he went to the bathroom, The door was still closed and locked, and when he knocked, there was no response. So he ended up breaking down the door. And inside, he found Kristen unresponsive in a shallow pool of water in the tub. Now, when the police arrived, she was declared dead that morning on June 16th. Now, prior to Eric coming over, Kristen had talked to one of her friends on the phone who said that she was in great spirits. He said that she was looking forward to leaving Seattle behind and closing that chapter of her life. Eric was the last person to see her that night. Did his visit change things? Now, by all accounts, Kristen was clean and happy, and she was looking forward to leaving her life in Seattle behind. But police say that a bag filled with drug paraphernalia was found near her in the apartment. Her official cause of death was acute opiate intoxication. To many people, this did not make sense, especially her mother. Janet pressed police to investigate her daughter's death as a homicide, but police said there was no evidence of foul play and that it was an overdose. Now, I talked a lot about SPD's death investigation procedures in the deep dive into Kurt. Remember Dr. Hartshorn? He performed Kurt's autopsy, and he also did Kristen's. Now remember, he was a close personal friend of Courtney Love, so you can see how for some people this might seem suspicious, especially because we know there was tension between the two. Now we all know that Courtney Love says some crazy things, but in an interview with Rolling Stone that she did 7 months after Kristen's death, which would have been 9 months after Kurt's, she had this to say about Kristen, quote, "I didn't process it, man. The only time I processed it was when I spoke with her mother. I could not extend in words to lose your child. I had to go over there and get Eric away from the body. Kristen was his lover for a really long time. He had already broken down bathroom door after bathroom door for her. He'd kick in drug dealers' doors." End quote. So, she said she had to go over there and get Eric away from Kristen's body. When? When were they both over there when Kristen was dead? That night that Paul checked on her, she was snoring in the bathroom. And in the morning when he went inside, he said the bathroom door was still locked. In fact, he had to break down the door before calling 911. She was a DOA at 10:40 a.m. when police arrived, and the only person noted on scene on SPD's incident log is Paul. Now we know from Tom Grant's investigation that Courtney said many contradicting things, but this one was just very specific and, like I said, highly irregular. But the one thing that bothers me about her response in that interview, and maybe it just rubs me the wrong way for some reason, it's her choice of words. People knew Kristen had gotten herself clean, yet Courtney chose to highlight the idea that Eric had to break down multiple bathroom doors because of Kristen's drug use. Is that even really accurate? We just don't know. But it feels like a jab that she didn't have to take. You know what I mean? All that being said, when it comes to the death of someone with a history of addiction, I see it both ways. Unfortunately, I've known people who were sober and seemed to be in a great place in their life, go back to using, and that one time that they did, it resulted in their death. And that reality can be hard to accept, especially for those closest to them when you've seen them work so hard to get well. Given the circumstances, though, I can also see how one could wonder if Kristen was injected with heroin against her will. The sad truth is, I don't think we'll ever really know, but I'm curious about what you guys think. Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.